They abandoned him. I knew my tribe mates rage at it. I shared it, but I am a shaman. It is my duty to stay as we fight for the spirit of Keith, to heal the wounds that were left to fester. It is my duty as his wife. So much pain, and I do not understand why they stepped away. For the goal, competitors would have fought one another to take Keith in, to add him to their legend and legacy. But these humans care more about the shell left over after the spirit departs. It spoke well of my husband that he kept moving, but I could already feel the strain. His first wife, Kendra, began the process of healing his spirit, and I watched his spirit become full the moment he held his daughter Heather, named for his own mother, and for the first time since his father's funeral, I saw tears in his eyes, his happiness greater than he could contain. Even as he gave up sleep to tend to her, he was happy for it, holding her, singing songs to comfort her. His world was complete, his purpose found in being a father, and I knew that purpose would be destroyed by an accident. I watched as he brought them back to the home he'd grown up in, preparing to leave military service, to be where he belonged. His last campaign, however, would go so incredibly wrong. The scene shifted to a place of unending sand. The sun scorched the land as Keith rode with his small group of soldiers on the hunt for evil men. Those evil men would injure a child to play on the sympathies of Keith and his war band, and it succeeded. Despite the threat and the orders of their chiefs, the war band diverted to rescue the boy, and suddenly the scene was rocked by explosions and gunfire. The war wagon lurched, going onto its side. Keith was on the ground side, pushing himself up quickly, and grabbing a weapon, climbed up through the door, some invisible force striking against the protected wagon. Though he scanned around, his movements were to a single purpose: get to the child. His war band did not stay still either. They pushed out the glass at the front to give them another exit and came out fighting, drawing the fire of the enemies. This was a way of war I was completely unfamiliar with. For the goal, our forces met one another on the field in pitched battle. Certainly, we had bows and other weapons for range, but the thick of the battle was where we found glory. There seemed to be no glory to this war, just death. 2 died as they attempted to exit, struck down by that same invisible force. But the ones who followed achieved vengeance for their fallen, and then Keith was ripped from the ground as the enemy weapon found a weakness in his armor. Taken off of his feet but a moment, he was propelled to the ground as more gunfire erupted around him. The noise of it was beyond anything I'd ever heard, and I could feel the minds of the tribe reeling at the level of violence that was in his memory. But Keith would not be stopped. He rolled, found his feet, and propelled himself forward for the boy, even as the pain in his chest raged. His eyes, though, told the story. He would not let the boy die, whatever the cost. He fired back at the enemy, forcing them back. He could barely raise his one arm, and with the pain, his shots were missing their mark, but the enemy fell back, unwilling to risk themselves. Cowards. He closed to grab the child, abandoning his weapon to grab him and move him back to the wagon, using it and himself to shield the child, and unslung his bag despite the pain he was in. He stopped the immediate bleeding as he listened to it all around him, forcing himself to concentrate, then moved on to others of the war band doing what he could. Most would not survive, and Keith had to make that call again and again, focusing on the ones he could save while having to turn away from those too far gone, to choose who of his friends would die in these sands. There was nothing for it. He could save those that could re-enter the fight, or waste his time on the dead, and Keith chose the living. One final man from amongst the enemy attempted to end Keith's life, approaching from behind with a knife. Keith heard the boy cry out and turned in time to fight for his life, grabbing the man and wrestling with him. He forced his injured sidearm to move. Weak or not, it was better than nothing. The position he ended up in was the reverse of the hold that Val had used in her fight with Traeg, and when he locked the hold in, I felt and heard the bones of the man's neck break, Keith using the strength of his legs to aid. He rolled the body off of him and got back to his work. All but 3 of the war band, Keith included, remained, including the boy, and all were injured. Keith called over a device while another member of the band treated his own wounds. The weapon had blown a hole through him completely and out his back. Keith didn't cry out as they sewed his wounds, still speaking.
We can't stay here. Soon as we can. We need to get on the move.
They carried the boy in turns, forcing themselves to jog over the sand until their own army found them. The boy would be returned to his family, but Keith and the others would be taken to a military hospital for their wounds. They would receive medals for their work, but for all but Keith, their injuries were too much to remain in the fight, and they would be sent home. Keith pushed himself to heal, to be able to get back. When the base chief came in,
Sergeant Morehouse, we need to talk.
Keith sighed.
I'm not getting there fast enough, am I, sir?
The older soldier shook his head.
No, you're healing great, soldier, but you need to come with me.
He brought Keith to another room where Keith sat in his wheelchair as the chief continued.
It is my duty to inform you that this morning, your wife Kendra and daughter Heather were killed.
Keith screamed, a cry that ripped through all of us, trying to will it to be untrue, and the connection wavered. It was too much, and the final rent in his spirit formed. We watched as he fought back against it and failed, his body unmoving for some time in his hospital bed. Then he threw himself into the work of healing his body, but even with the shaman seeing to him, his spirit had been ripped apart, and eventually he would be returned home as well, unfit to return to the battlefield. He returned to Pop Pop's house, the home he had brought Kendra and Heather to live in, and saw to their funerals, the final goodbyes to his entire life. His dreams ripped the wounds open every morning, returning him to lose them again. The people around him said kind words, but none stepped in, and even the shamans he saw did little more than talk to him about it and give him things to drug it away. Finally, a night came, the day that marked the birth of his daughter, and the damage to his spirit was past the breaking point. He walked into his daughter's room, holding his father's weapon, the same his father had used those years ago, and sat staring at an empty crib, staring at the weapon as Keith's song broke through. If you could see all my abuse and spend a day inside my shoes, you'd realize why I just want to lose. You'd realize why I just want to lose. Will anyone believe the hell of being me before I decide to be the dying proof? He sat, staring at the weapon, attempting to will himself to use it, to end the misery that had been his entire life, and I felt Val move, stepping into the scene. This was the true source, the point of the final break, and I stepped forward as well. This was our duty, our pledge. I felt the other minds depart to another memory as we took our place with the Keith who had come so close to ending his life. It did not change the memory, but we could be there in his mind, knowing it all and begin the task of rebuilding the shattered spirit.